NPR News in Washington, I'm Corba Coleman. President Biden is using an appearance at a UN climate summit in Scotland to push for his signature foreign policy effort, a plan to counter China by funding infrastructure projects around the world. NPR's Scott Detrow has more from Glasgow.
Biden began his second day at the climate summit by pledging to spend billions to restore forests around the world. But like so much of Biden's climate agenda, that would require sign-off from Congress. Biden also appeared with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to talk up his plans to fund more infrastructure projects in developing nations.
There is an urgent need for infrastructure development in countries, and infrastructure that prioritizes, when you build it, prioritizes the fight against climate change from the moment the spade goes in the ground and jumpstarts green economic growth.
Biden is also announcing new plans to curb methane emissions. Scott Detrow, NPR News, Glasgow.
Advisors to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are meeting today to review detailed recommendations for Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine for younger children. The shots have been authorized by the Food and Drug Administration. Now it's up to the CDC. Two powerful explosions have rocked the Afghan capital, Kabul. The Taliban say at least 3 people have been killed and more than 15 others injured. The BBC's Electra Naismith reports.
The explosions rocked the Afghan capital. A huge plume of smoke could be seen from some distance away. The Taliban spokesman confirmed that the first blast had hit the entrance gate to the capital's biggest military hospital. The second went off nearby, both apparently targeting civilians. Staff had reported heavy fighting taking place inside. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. One report said a number of Islamic State fighters had entered the hospital and clashed with security forces. Taliban special forces are said to be trying to secure the area.
The BBC's Electra Naismith reporting. Stocks open higher this morning as the Federal Reserve begins a 2-day policy meeting. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose about 16 points in early trading.
The Fed is widely expected to announce a slowdown in the bond buying program that launched early in the pandemic in an effort to prop up the economy. Interest rates are expected to remain near zero, despite inflation that's running well above the central bank's long-range target of 2%. Pfizer says it expects sales of its COVID-19 vaccine to reach $36 billion this year. The company also raised its sales forecast for next year as it ramps up annual production to 4 billion doses. Tesla stock soared in recent days on news that Hertz was planning to buy 100,000 of its electric cars, but the shares dipped this morning after Tesla CEO Elon Musk warned that's not a done deal. Musk tweeted his company has far more demand than it can supply right now and adds it won't be offering the rental car company any discount. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
On Wall Street, the Dow is now up about 30 points at 35,943. This is NPR.
What did advocates for and against a Texas abortion law hear when the Supreme Court spoke yesterday? Justices, of course, did not rule on the law, but they did hear arguments over the law that bans most abortions after 6 weeks. Because that 6-week ban blatantly contradicts the Constitution, the law does not tell state officials to enforce it, and instead offers bounties to random people anywhere in the country if they sue. Ashley Lopez of KUT in Austin has been following this debate and is on the line once again. Ashley, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with what you heard. You're a journalist, you're listening. What did you hear when the justices were asking their questions of the lawyers?
Well, I mean, these hearings were really limited in scope. They were mostly focused on the way Texas is enforcing its abortion ban by having private citizens sue people who provide or help provide an abortion to someone past that 6-week limit. This enforcement mechanism has made it really hard for folks like abortion providers to actually challenge this in court. So the justices are weighing in on whether it's okay for Texas to basically deputize private citizens to enforce its laws.
Well, let's start with abortion providers who, of course, were part of the case and were listening to the case. What did they make of the justices' questions?
So after the hearings, attorneys representing the abortion providers who sued talked about how it went. They said they thought a lot of the questions asked by the justices, including from some of the more conservative members like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, seemed to indicate that they had concerns about how this law seems to skirt the courts in Texas. One of the lawyers is Julie Murray with Planned Parenthood. She says that while this could be a good sign for plaintiffs, it doesn't change the fact that a few weeks ago, the same court refused to temporarily block the law from being in effect as these legal challenges continue.
Certainly, we are heartened by the vigorous questioning of today's hearing, but the reality on the ground is that until SB 8 is stopped some sort of injunction, patients still suffering irreparable harm.
Murray pointed out that it's now been more than 60 days during which Texas has had different abortion rights than the rest of the country, and it's not clear whether yesterday's hearing might convince the justices to change their mind and block the law even temporarily.
Okay, abortion providers heartened but still concerned. What about anti-abortion groups in Texas?
I talked to John Siegel with Texas Right to Life. He says he was glad to see that the court seems skeptical about the suit brought by the Justice Department. I think one of the big takeaways by legal observers is that the court seemed more inclined to allow the suit brought by the abortion providers to move forward compared to the case brought by the federal government. But either way, anti-abortion groups continue to claim a big victory in the fact that the law has stayed in effect throughout all of this back and forth in the courts. And John Siegel told me he thinks the court will probably keep the law in place even though justices have concerns about some aspects of how this law was crafted.
So we believe that's going to be the case, is that no matter how they rule on the standings and jurisdiction questions for the case to move forward, they seem to be in a position to allow the law to affect.
For their part, abortion providers in Texas are really concerned about what will happen to clinics and abortion access in the state if this law is allowed to stay in effect even just a little longer. They say this could eventually lead to many clinics to have to shut down indefinitely and maybe forever.
Okay, Ashley, thanks so much for the update. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ashley Lopez is a reporter at KUT in Austin.
They can fly at 55 miles an hour, have wingspans of up to 10 feet, and even made a brief appearance in Jurassic Park.
Condors are on the verge of extinction. If I was to create a flock of condors on this island, you wouldn't have anything to say.
Well, new research says female California condors are able to create their own flocks on their own. A study published this past week described how 2 female condors reproduced without male partners. It's apparently the first time that any female bird without access to a male has done so. Their offspring, which both hatched and passed away years ago, were the result of a process called parthenogenesis. That's when an embryo is able to develop from a self-fertilized egg. Scientists have studied virgin births among bees, ants, sharks, and other animals, but then genetic testing confirmed the California condors could have them too.
It hit us in the face. We weren't looking for it. We didn't expect it.
That's Oliver Ryder of the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, one of the geneticists behind the research, speaking with member station KPBS. It's a surprise in part because the endangered birds are under such close observation. California condors have been on the verge of extinction for decades, but with careful management, their population has grown from some 24 in the early 1980s to more than 500 today. Some researchers say parthenogenesis could be a survival response. It's not clear if or when it could happen again. Still, as Jurassic Park's Dr. Ian Malcolm once proclaimed,
life finds a way.
NPR One is your place to find all of NPR's podcasts along with tons of other shows we think you'll love. Follow your favorites. We'll play new episodes for you and feature them on your home screen. Or if you're on the hunt for a new binge listen, check out the Explore tab for recommended podcasts from NPR, your local station, and beyond.
Okay, New York City's vaccine mandate for municipal workers took effect yesterday. About 9,000 city workers were sent home without pay, which is a small fraction of the city's workforce, but another 12,000 are waiting to hear back about possible exemptions to the mandate. WNYC's Jake Offenhartz reports.
At a sanitation garage on Staten Island, dozens of city employees gathered to protest the new vaccine mandate. Passing drivers honked in support as workers held up slips of paper confirming their suspensions. Among them was Brian, a sanitation worker who declined to give his last name, citing professional ramifications.
I'm on leave without pay, LWOP, starting today, November 1st. Nobody makes choices for me. I make my choices.
Brian says he actually did get vaccinated last week, but he's refusing to turn over his proof of vaccination in solidarity with his colleagues, like Wendell Rivera, who's adamant about not getting the shot.
It's gonna get bad in the streets, bro. The garbage is gonna pile up. The manpower, we already have enough manpower problems. People want to work. People want to work. You're not letting us work. It's backwards.
Garbage has already been piling up. In the last week, complaints of uncollected trash have increased tenfold compared to last month, as sanitation workers have slowed or completely abandoned their routes. Juan Guatle, a nonprofit worker who supports the mandate, says his street hasn't received a trash pickup in over a week.
I'm kind of disappointed by sanitation workers because they should think about their families, the community, and get the vaccine and just protect themselves.
Despite the protests, the vast majority of city employees are complying with the vaccine mandate. As of Sunday, 91% had gotten the shot, up from 84% when the full mandate was announced last month, according to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio.
City workers are doing the right thing. I want to thank everyone who got vaccinated. I know people have a lot of questions and concerns. Thank you for getting vaccinated. Thank you for doing the right thing. Thank you for moving us forward.
The mayor has said that fire and ambulance response times have not been impacted, and several fire companies did shut down over the weekend, and many others were understaffed. New York City has not seen the same mass resignations of police officers that some feared. That may be because 8,000 members of the NYPD have applied for medical and religious exemption, more than any other city agency. They'll find out whether they qualify or if they need to get vaccinated in the coming days. For NPR News, I'm Jake Offenhartz in New York.
Every day on Air Talk, Larry Mantle gives answers to your questions about COVID. And now, you can get Larry's daily COVID update on a new podcast, COVID in LA. Listen at LAist.com, on the KPCC app, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Good morning, it's Tuesday, November 2nd. I'm Suzanne Wadley, and you're listening to the LA Report from KPCC and LAist.com. Here's your morning news. High school seniors are in the thick of college application season. Most freshman applications for UC and Cal State campuses are due by the end of November. KPCC College Pathways reporter Jill Replocal tells you what students and families should know when applying in this pandemic 2021.
If you haven't been able to take the SATs or ACTs, don't worry. More than 75% of all U.S. colleges don't require them as part of your application this year. That includes UC and CSU schools. If a school says that submitting scores is optional, college advisors say it really is optional. But if you took a test and got good scores, it may give you an edge. If the pandemic wrecked everything about your high school career, many applications have a space to explain that. But maybe only write about it in your college essay if you truly have something you need to say. Finally, starting out at a community college and transferring to a four-year is a good option. And you have a lot more time to apply. Covering pathways to higher education, I'm Jill Replocal.
At USC, some student and faculty groups are calling for an end to fraternities after allegations of multiple druggings and sexual assaults at parties thrown by members of the Sigma Nu House. Los Angeles Times higher education reporter Teresa Watanabe says since fraternities are still able to exist without university approval, accountability may come through a more crowdsourced route.
And that could be, anything ranging from posting data on websites about fraternities and how many student conduct complaints or substantiated sexual assault charges or dangerous drinking, maybe alcohol transports to hospitals. So people can then look on the website and make an informed decision as to whether they really want to risk those sorts of behaviors if they join a fraternity.
The claims became public several weeks after they were reported to university officials. USC President Carol Folt says the lag in the announcement was troubling and brought to light a gray area between taking assault reports, providing confidential support, and informing the public. USC says more allegations have since come in about multiple fraternities, and as a result, all fraternity socials have been suspended indefinitely. The U.S. Department of Justice has charged a 20-year-old Orange County man this week with assault and interfering with a flight crew while on an American Airlines flight. He was ordered released on a $10,000 bond and banned from flying American Airlines. Since last Friday, Los Angeles has been accepting applications for the Big Leap. That's the city's guaranteed basic income program. Families accepted into the pilot program will receive $1,000 a month for a year. Families can use the money on essentials such as food and utilities, but there are plenty of Angelinos in need who just don't qualify.
Of course, if I'm on the poverty level, I'm barely making it.
That's Julia, who did not want to give her last name. She's in the right income bracket, but she doesn't have kids under 18. Councilmember Curran Price, whose office is partially funding the basic income program, says help is still available.
For those who don't meet the qualifications, we certainly are still going to be referring them to a variety of social services that are available within the city and in the county.
Applicants for the program who do meet the criteria will be asked to fill out a multi-page questionnaire as part of a study run by the University of Pennsylvania. But once they're accepted, the people are not obliged to participate further in that study. There's more information on our website, las.com. City Councilman Kevin DeLeon now chairs the Council's Homelessness and Poverty Committee. It's the committee that guides the city's policies on unhoused Angelenos. He takes over from Councilman Mark Ridley Thomas, who is suspended from daily council duties after he was indicted on federal bribery charges. DeLeon represents Skid Row, Boyle Heights, Eagle Rock, and Highland Park. Thank you for listening to the LA Report. I'm Suzanne Watley. Join us again next time. Meantime, you can read more news at las.com and or listen live at kpcc.org.
This program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
It's Election Day in several states, including Virginia, the final day for Virginia voters to cast a ballot for former Governor Terry McAuliffe, who's a Democrat, or Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate. Ben Pavier covers state politics at member station VPM in Richmond and joins us now in this suddenly blue state that is now on the verge of a red result. We'll see how things go here, though. Ben, good morning.
Good morning.
What were the candidates' rallies like on the final full day of campaigning yesterday?
Well, the Youngkin rally was pretty boisterous. He held it inside an airport hangar south of Richmond. He and McAuliffe, the similarity, I would say, was their message was just get out and vote. These off-year elections don't usually get the same level of turnout as presidential or even midterm ones. For Youngkin, animating the base means talking in his case about the way race is taught in schools. And he said schools were teaching students to view everything through the lens of race.
So on day one, I will ban critical race theory from being in our schools.
And it's worth noting here that critical race theory isn't actually in Virginia's K-12 curriculum.
Yeah, I suppose we should be clear here. The discussion about how to talk about race is a real discussion, but he's come up with an imaginary take here and has gotten to the verge of the governor's office on this imaginary take. What about Democrat Terry McAuliffe?
His rally was much smaller. He held it at a Richmond brewery, still energetic. I mean, McAuliffe said this talk of banning critical race theory is, quote, a racist dog whistle. McAuliffe spent a lot of his speech talking about what he could claim as earlier accomplishments in the governor's office. That includes things like restoring voting rights for felons and increasing funding for education.
So all I'm trying to say is, when you give Democrats the power, good things happen, right?
McAuliffe also spent a lot of time connecting Youngkin to former President Trump, who lost Virginia twice. When he was trying to win the Republican nomination, Youngkin's only real campaign issue was promoting what he called election integrity. And Trump endorsed Youngkin as recently as last night in a phone call that was described as a tele-rally. McAuliffe is making the argument that Youngkin is a kind of Trump enabler.
So how does this reflect national trends, if it does at all?
Well, there's a general trend in Virginia that the party that wins the White House loses the governor's race the next year. McAuliffe is the only one to break that trend in the last 30 years or so. And both parties are testing their strategies. For Democrats, the big question is whether Trump is still a motivator to get their base out and vote, even when he's not on the ballot. And it's also a test of their power. They've been in control of Virginia now for 2 years. So there's a question of how voters respond to Democratic control of Richmond and now Capitol Hill, too. And I think for Republicans, they're looking at Youngkin for maybe as a way to learn to win over the MAGA faithful without making the election too much about Trump himself. And they're testing messaging here around critical race theory and school curriculum.
The Democrats finally in recent years got control of the state legislature, which had been coming for a long time. Is it possible that they could lose it again?
They could lose the lower chamber. Virginia's House is all up for election. Democrats will control Virginia's Senate no matter what for the next couple of years. So we'll have to see how these two parties can cooperate if Youngkin wins or if McAuliffe wins and the Republicans flip the House.
Ben, thanks for the update.
Thank you.
Ben Pavier covers state politics for VPM in Richmond.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Wyzant. Wyzant connects you with tutors in more than 12,000 topics for personalized one-on-one lessons. Get $25 off your first 3 tutoring lessons by signing up at wyzant.com/NPR.
Hi, this is Jeff. After 24 hours of travel from Washington, D.C., I finally made it to Cairo yesterday, and I'm standing in front of the Great Pyramids. This podcast was recorded at...
It is 2:05 p.m. on Monday, November 1st, 2021.
Things may have changed by the time you hear it, but I'm guessing these pyramids will be here for another 4,500 years. All right, here's the show.
Wow, I mean, these people are like flying all over the place, and what I mean by these people is like our fans and listeners.
And some other people too, Aisha. Please don't discount.
Yes, and some other people too. Hey there, it's the NPR Politics Podcast. I'm Aisha Roscoe. I cover the White House.
And I'm Scott Detrow. I also cover the White House.
And there is a big UN climate convention happening in Scotland. And speaking of people flying all over the place, Scott, you are there in Scotland.
I am.
You are. And also in Scotland is NPR's Dan Charles, who covers climate for us. Hey, Dan.
Nice to have me here.
Glad to have you. So it feels like there is a lot riding on this moment. If people have been following these sorts of meetings and these sorts of summits, it feels like there's always a lot riding on it because it is the climate itself that is riding on it, right? And so the goal that everyone wants to hit is keeping the world from warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius this century compared to pre-industrial levels. Dan, how much has the world warmed so far? And there have been a lot of commitments already made on climate. Have countries actually made any progress on this?
Well, yeah. So some basic background. You know, we are already hotter. Just over 1 degree Celsius. It's almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the planet was before we started burning all the fossil fuels. Countries have made all these promises, and it's an official process within the UN. What you promise that you will do. If all the countries did everything that they say that they will do, and they did it on schedule, depending on what all you include, we'd be looking at the planet warming up by 2.1 degrees Celsius to 2.7 degrees Celsius. So basically twice the warming that we have seen so far.
And so that is the background for this meeting. Scott, the U.S. came into this meeting. We've talked about how Biden has had, to pull out some key measures that were in his big Build Back Better plan. Like, what is the mood like? Because obviously countries like the U.S. and China, even though the leader of China is not there, these are the countries that have burned the most fossil fuels and that they're very rich, and there's a lot of focus on them.
Yeah. Actually, this totally wasn't pre-planned, but thinking about it right now, the fate of the Build Back Better bill is actually like a really good metaphor for what's going on with climate right now. And let me tell you why. On one hand, it is a promise and it is not complete right now. Biden has been expressing increased optimism over the past few days that there could be a vote at some point this week, but it's not lined up yet. So right now it's a lot of promises and not a concrete thing. Secondly, Biden keeps talking about the fact that the bill in its existing form would be the biggest climate bill ever. It's something like $500 billion, a little bit north of that. That would incentivize the fast shift to clean energy through tax breaks, through incentives, through research, and things like that. He keeps saying it's the most ever, and that's true, but it's not enough. And I think that's going on globally with climate right now. A lot of countries are making promises, making progress, but it's nowhere near enough that is needed. And the big thing that we talked about is this big thing called the Clean Electricity Plan had a real regulatory scheme in place that would have forced power plants to make the shift faster. That's not there anymore, and I think that makes a lot of people skeptical that Biden can stick to the big promises he's touting here of having the U.S.'s greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 by the end of the decade.
So what are people saying in these speeches? There were a lot of speeches today. Like, what are they saying, considering the fact that they're going to try to take action, but the action even that they have promised to take is not enough to save the planet? So, like, what are they saying?
Biden said a lot of the things that he said before about how big of a problem, an existential problem this is, how immediate action is needed. He tried to frame climate action as something that can be an economic plus, creating more jobs. I thought it was interesting that he pretty clearly addressed the fact that the U.S. has failed to meet its promises over and over again, saying at this point he's really serious. It's not just a promise. He's going to follow through with action. And then later at a sidebar panel here today, he straight up apologized for Donald Trump, the former president, pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement a few years ago, even though Biden immediately rejoined it.
We haven't heard from all the countries so far, but everybody has put in, their promises. So we kind of know where countries stand on this. And, the U.S. is in this interesting position where it is, like, per capita, it's the biggest polluter, right? Per person, we put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than anybody. But the promises that Biden are making, the actual goal is very significant. That would be a big cut. The idea of getting to net zero within 30 years is incredibly ambitious. And if the U.S. could do that, it would be a tremendous success. I mean, there are other countries who, maybe they are, more sort of, petroleum dollar based, like Saudi Arabia, or maybe they're just growing and they don't want to sort of cut themselves off, from the power plants that they have, and they don't have a lot of money. Let's say India. There are some countries that have basically said that goal is not for us. We can't do this net zero by 2050 thing.
But Dan, are there any recent successes that people have been able to point to heading into this conference?
Yeah. So I'm going to be the optimist on this conversation.
I haven't heard many of that this week, so I welcome it.
Yeah, there are these commitments on paper, right? There's the U.S. one, the European Union, and as I said, if every country carried out the stuff that they have put down on paper, it would limit warming to something like 2.1 degrees Celsius, which, when this whole conversation about global warming started, that was actually the goal that people set. Limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. That would be really significant. And the thing is, it has catalyzed all kinds of discussions within countries all over the world. Once you put these goals out there, okay, so maybe you fail to meet them, but, people start talking about how would you actually get there? And that's happening in the U.S., it's happening in lots of countries. Some specific things that people are doing. I mean, the phase out of coal is starting. I mean, there was this commitment over the weekend, no more finance for coal plants that, would be built in foreign countries. Anyway, I think we are in a better place than we were even a year or 2 years ago when things really looked, I would say, much more hopeless.
But some of this issue is the push and pull between long-term climate changes have to be now, so it's not necessarily just long-term, but short-term pain. There are trade-offs there. Scott Biden did have to say that, there's still a need for oil and gas production right now.
Yeah, that was an interesting moment over the weekend at the G20 summit in Rome. I think we're going to be talking about this a lot more over the next few months on the podcast. There's probably going to be a pretty tight energy supply worldwide over the winter. Supply, like everything else, supply is messed up. Energy prices are really high. There's a lot of concern that energy prices could spike, and it'll be a huge problem for millions and millions of people around the world. So Biden has been pushing on oil-producing countries to increase their production, to get more oil out there. And he was asked about, hey, how can you say we need to totally phase out oil and call for this at the same time? And he made the argument, John Kerry also made the argument in a call with reporters, the world runs on fossil fuels right now, and you have to be realistic about that. People need to be able to drive to work. And I thought that this moment that he talked about that was this interesting concession of how hard the immediate politics are, because in the end, if you do want to totally change the global economy, it's going to take changes to people's everyday lives.
The idea that there's an alternative to walk away from being able to get in your automobile is just not realistic. It's not going to happen.
So I thought that was an interesting reality check on why, it's easier to make promises at a big climate conference than to pass massive bills that change your economy away from fossil fuels.
All right, well, I think we'll leave that right there, take a quick break, and we'll be back with more on how rich and poor countries are dealing with climate change.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Grifols. Senior Director of Corporate Affairs, Vlasta Hakes, explains the science behind the plasma-derived medicines the company produces.
Plasma contains proteins and antibodies. There are people who are missing those antibodies, or they're missing a protein that helps their body function. And what Grifols then does is we collect this plasma and then isolate those proteins and antibodies to produce a medicine.
To learn more about donating plasma and to find a Grifols center near you, visit grifolsplasma.com.
How do you keep up with all the important news that's happening on any given day? You could check your phone alerts every minute, but you might strain your neck. Or you could listen to Up First and consider this, NPR's short daily morning and afternoon podcasts. Bookend your day with them wherever you listen.
And we're back. We've talked a lot about the big and wealthy countries so far, but I did want to talk about how poor and developing economies fit into this, because of course the complaint from a lot of poorer countries is that you had the U.S. And others who got rich and got this high quality of life, burning fossil fuels cheaply, and now these countries are asking the world to shift to more expensive energy, and they don't have the same resources that the U.S. has. So did that come up at all?
Well, it does come up a lot. I mean, I was looking into this recently for a couple of stories, and I was looking at specific countries, and one kind of caught my attention. It's Bangladesh. People might not realize, but Bangladesh's economy has been actually growing quite rapidly in recent years. They're using more energy. So the plan that they submitted to the UN for how they're going to reduce emissions basically said, we will try to reduce emissions from the trajectory we're on. But that trajectory was amazing. It would have them tripling their greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade, right? So that's what they say. That's the path they're on, and they say, okay, we'll scale back a little bit from that. I think they're sort of making this point that we're growing. We want to grow. We want to become more prosperous, and that means, greenhouse gas emissions increasing. However, there's another side to this, and I really think in a lot of countries the conversation has changed from what it was, say, 10 years ago. And I think people do actually now think that there is a different path to prosperity that is possible. One that doesn't rely on fossil fuels. You mentioned like expensive energy. I mean, renewables can be quite cheap. I mean, you do have to build them though, and that takes money. I mean, all these transformations take a lot of money. And so that's now what the key argument is about. Not so much about emission reductions, but where's the money, right? And there's an initial estimate of $100 billion that the rich countries are supposed to contribute. That's just like a small down payment. Eventually, we're talking trillions.
And Aisha, of all people, Prince Charles was pretty blunt about that, both at the G20 over the weekend and then at the climate summit today, saying, unless trillions of dollars are spent each year, it's just not enough to make the changes that are needed right now.
And our rich countries, I know you said they're looking at putting up $100 billion, but is there anything more on the willingness to spend those trillions of dollars, or where that money would come from?
I think there is going to be progress on that. The thing is, the governments don't have the money. It's the private sector that has the money, and so it's this question of is there enough of an incentive for sort of private capital to really go in? And sort of finance these things. And for the clean energy side of it, maybe there would be. There's another side though, where, it's going to be harder, and that is just dealing with adaptation to climate change. And that is not something you make money on, right? And so that's another big issue. The poorer countries of the world are asking for a lot more money for what they call adaptation, but also what they just call loss and damages. Basically saying, we didn't cause this, you caused it. We're facing incredible amount of damages. You should pay for this.
All right, we will leave it there. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Aisha Roscoe. I cover the White House.
And I'm Scott Tetro. I also cover the White House.
And thank you for listening to the NPR Politics Podcast.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Virgin Atlantic, where every